comments have drawn fire from everywhere. Disability advocates and politicians have slammed the One Nation senators' calls for children with conditions like autism to be removed from mainstream classes. Senator Hanson today claimed her comments were taken out of context, but she also said she'd received messages of support from parents and teachers. Lauren Day reports.
I hear so many times from parents and teachers whose time is taken up with children in the classroom, whether they have a disability or whether they are autistic, that it is taking up the teacher's time. That's not what the people want.
Pauline Hanson prides herself on giving an outspoken voice to the silent majority.
And I'm not denying them. If it was one of my children, I'd love all the time given to them, to give them those opportunities. But is it at the loss of our other kids?
But this time, she seems to be in the minority.
She owes an apology to every single autistic child in this country, every one of the parents who are like me, because we've got better things to do than defend our kids.
I feel outraged by what is being said by Pauline Hanson, but that is nothing in comparison to what these kids must be feeling today.
In a single word, annoyed. Very annoyed.
I think one of the descriptions that was provided of Senator Hanson's comments was that they were archaic, and that's absolutely right.
Today, Senator Hanson clarified her position, saying schools haven't had the funding to cope with students with disabilities.
Autism is one disability that often presents behavioural issues. The problem comes to a head when the schools have a lack of classroom support, which is most common, and the teacher is left to manage the behaviour by themselves. Every child has a right to an education. Every child has a right to move forward with their lives. And I will not back away from my comments.
One thing that I like about school is doing art.
Archer Beasley's mother had to quit her job to care for him. She put a lot of work into finding the best education option for her son. It turned out to be the local state school.
He has some social support and he's been given some extra coaching with regards how to make friends, how to access different games during lunchtime. The social side, which has been fantastic and what a lot of our kids need, I couldn't be happier.
But she agrees with Senator Hanson about one thing, that resourcing is an issue.
We want more training, more resources so that these adjustments are made so the children can access the curriculum and the teachers want that support and want that resourcing.
And we need to get rid of these people because you want everyone to feel good about themselves.
The system is absolutely broken, but let's be very clear. The answer is not to segregate kids with disability. That is, we're not going back.
Stephanie Gottlieb is an advocate who's heard numerous horror stories. She's also a mother of 2 children with disabilities, including her son Danny.
Look at me, I'm a kid with a disability. I've been in a mainstream school all my life, and now I've passed VCE and studying a bachelor in a university.
Do you think you would have had a different experience if you went to, a special needs school?
I would have said, and I would have had a worse experience.
He went through 3 different mainstream schools and says they were a mixed bag.
When I moved to my first high school, that was just a nightmare.
Despite the challenges, both Danny and his mum still believe that inclusive education is best for students with and without disabilities. But they want more funding than is included in Gonski Mark II to meet the growing population of students with special needs.
If we can't get adequate funding, we're not going to be able to implement the breadth of reform needed for students with disability. We clearly have a system in crisis and we need to ensure that students with disability are front and centre in the reform.
Of course, our schools could always have more resources. Of course we could give them more resources. But I think at the moment, most of the schools that I see, I can speak for the schools in my electorate, do a really good job of integrating those kids with that little bit of extra special need into the schools.
Liberal MP Craig Kelly's adult son Trent has Down syndrome and is also on the autism spectrum. He says Trent was far better off at a special school but that the decision should be up to parents.
At the end of the day, I think parents know in their heart what is best for their child. Yes, everyone, you have that goal, you set out with that goal that your child should be in a mainstream school. But parents know that if that's not right for their child, they will put them into a special school.
Despite criticising her comments, the Coalition needs Pauline Hanson's vote to secure its Gonski 2.0 funding package. Those at the centre of the argument are glad disability education is finally on the agenda, but say their opinions are the ones being left out of the debate.
In my opinion, democracy is a way for every voice to be heard, but when some voices are just ignored, then the entire system has the potential to be flawed.
Do you feel like your voice is being ignored as someone with special needs?
Sometimes it really feels like that.
Tonight in Federal Parliament, the Senate's getting closer to voting on the Turnbull Government's schools funding package. In a bid to win over the crossbench, the government's thrown an extra $5 billion into the plan, taking the total package to just under $23 billion. Despite the billions in extra funding for schools, the Labor Party, Education Union and the Catholic sector are promising to campaign hard against the model through to the next election. Let's cross to Canberra and 7:30's political correspondent Andrew Probe. And Probes, what's the latest on the bill's fate?
Well, as we know, the government needs 10 votes of the crossbench to get this through. It thought it had 10 votes yesterday, but this entire place, all of Parliament, has been on tenterhooks because of concerns about where Jackie Lambie really stood. Now, the Tasmanian Independent ended this game by saying that the game was over. She said that she would strongly support this legislation a short time ago and that she wouldn't be persuaded otherwise. So with that news, the government knew that it had 10 and the Labor Party knew that the government had those crucial 10 votes. Now, the Greens won't vote for it when it comes to a vote, we expect in the next hour or so. This is despite some of the Greens actually supporting the legislation. Indeed, improvements to the legislation that have been made is partly due to the Greens, so they'll take some credit, but they won't be there to say this was our job. Now, this is partly because of the very, very strong campaign from the Australian Education Union, which has threatened the careers of some in the Greens. Now, the 4 One Nation senators will be critical tonight, so Simon Birmingham has been very careful in what he says about Pauline Hanson's autism comments today.
So the crossbenchers have been at the centre of a bit of a flurry of activity to try to get them to feel pressure to change their positions.
Well, today they've had enormous pressure, even though, as I said, they thought they had all 10 locked in, because Jackie Lambie was seemingly a bit wobbly. She got the AEU down on her, the Catholics, Labor and the governments all coming in to make sure that they knew where she stood. But the pressure was also in the other house. Rebecca Sharkey, who is an NXT, Nick Xenophon team MP from South Australia, she had a bit of a run-in with Tanya Plibersek today, I understand, after question time, and was told that Labor would be campaigning hard in Mayo, and that even if that brought a Liberal MP in Mayo, and rather than NXT, then that would be it. So expect a very fierce campaign on schools from here on.
Why is Labor so desperate to see this bill fail when it embraces so many of the principles of their original Gonski legislation, and indeed it is backed by David Gonski?
Well, it's a very good question, but it comes down to the election campaign. The schools campaign last year was a big electoral plus for Bill Shorten, for Labor. I Give a Gonski Mark II is going to be a campaign that's a lot more difficult, especially when you've got the man who gave that campaign its name. He's given these reforms the big tick. So have other people behind Gonski. But look, Labor will also have to explain how and why it will spend $22 billion that it says it needs and wants to spend, and whether it will keep the funding model, because some of the government's reforms actually ends the subsidy of states which have been underfunding state schools.
Today is the final sitting day of Parliament for this first half of the year. If the government gets this Gonski bill through as it anticipates, it will consider that it's ending on a high. But when you look at the broad picture, how are things going for the government?
Well, it's not doing very well. It's been trailing in the polls now, 14 consecutive negative news polls. It's 53-47. That's wipeout territory. Now, we know that Western governments across the world are struggling. Why is that? There's a very good question, Lee. I'm glad you asked it. But it's lack of trust in establishment, I think, in the government and in traditional media. This is feeding into a very, very difficult time for all governments. So it's hard yards for this government. The voters aren't listening. And there are internal problems which only make it more difficult for Malcolm Turnbull. Plus, also, Bill Shorten is a very effective opposition leader. And tomorrow there's going to be some more problems potentially for the government. You've got 3 ministers who are going to go to the Victorian Court of Appeal to apologise for comments that they made critical of the Victorian judiciary. Greg Hunt, Michael Sukkar and Alan Tudge are going to issue an apology to the court to ensure that they don't get done for contempt, because if they get done for contempt, they could lose their seats in Parliament. And if they lose their seats in Parliament, the entire government could fall. So these are indeed very exciting days indeed.
Well, that'll be intriguing to watch that tomorrow. Thanks very much, Andrew.